Welcome to our third session discussing the book Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby. Today's session is not a rehash, but it's a response to chapters 8 and 9. First, a few comments on how the book is set up. Blackaby writes sort of like from the Bible to experience to a summary. His way of communicating about how God works in this world is focused in how we move from understanding God's will for the world to coming to know how Christ requires us to adjust our lives to Him as disciples, or as he says, a self-focused life to a God-focused life, and then how that brings us into serving Him and the way that we know Him as we follow Him and serve Him. And that is how God shapes the way we do things, particularly when it comes to the mission of reaching others with the love of Christ. He uses examples from the Bible as the basis for it all, and he moves between his own personal stories and the scriptures, and then he summarizes what those reveal about how we can work with God. And that becomes the basis for knowing God in experience. It is not primarily a book about inspiring stories or deep prayer where we feel our hearts strangely warmed by the Spirit. It's really a manual for knowing God in the experience of joining God in what God is doing right now all around you. And it leans from individual experience to how that happens in groups or entire churches responding to God's call to join him in mission. For Henry Blackaby in this book, that is normal Christian expectation in life. It's just the way it is. Worship, discipleship, pastoral care are all important, and that comes from joining God in God's mission. It's God's mission where people's lives are changed, where people become disciples, followers of Jesus, where marriages and families are healed, where people find hope and power to overcome addictions through the way God uses us, God's people, to minister them in their suffering. You really have to read this book not as an interesting slant on a Christian topic, but as your introduction, or for most of us, a reintroduction to life with God right now. And the life with God that we might be missing as the normal ongoing ministry of our own church. In this session, I'm not going to review and summarize chapters 8 and 9, but I strongly recommend that you read them and reread them, because we are now at the point of the book where we're turning toward the action phase, how to join God in what he's doing already all around you. These two chapters are built on everything that's gone before, which is why just watching these videos and perhaps coming to a Sunday discussion is not going to be enough for you to understand it. If you don't follow the logic that builds toward this way of seeing God from this perspective and doing ministry, I guarantee you, you will not agree with it, or you will not take it seriously as if God is actually speaking to Trinity Church right now. What I am doing in this session is to contrast two approaches to active mission so you can begin to get a feel for the difference. And then with God's help, we can actually begin to experiment in doing mission in this new way today. So in brief, I'm going to start with a standard way of churches, particularly Episcopal churches, in doing local mission. Let me say from the top that I'm not saying it's wrong or it's evil or anything less than it's inspired by the love of God tugging on people's hearts. And sometimes it works. Yet it is not the very effective way that God has demonstrated and shown us in Scripture on how he works. The story I'm telling you is one I made up. Okay, made it up. Here it is. In a church meeting, several people shared that they feel like the church should be more active in reaching the students that are at the university, which is just 200 yards from the church. Several professors attend the church, and they agree that there's a real need for students and describe some of the problems that they see happening on campus. They've seen growth of anxiety and issues in mental health, tremendous amounts of stress, as well as some of the old concerns that come from, well, heavy partying. The vestry and the priest agree, but the first question they have is, do we really have the resources to do a new ministry like this? Because the priest is already busy enough with all the current activities that he does at church and some diocesan commitments that he has. So over the next months, the business guys on the vestry call a consultant who invites them to come in and to hire a college chaplain, who can come in and work with students. They all agree, but then the next concern is, how can we afford even a half-time salary? Especially as the treasurer points out, college students aren't the biggest givers. So the work they do will not actually somehow help their very tight budget. So over the next 9 months, they actually raise the money. They cast a vision, church pitches in, and despite some real opposition from some old members, people who have been there for a while, who are afraid that it's going to cut into the budget for other things, like a new organ, they put it together and they decide, here we go. We're going to hire a new priest to come in and help us with this reaching students. Their main criteria, they think, is to have someone who's young and creative, who can identify with students. But there's a problem because, as we know, there's a priest shortage, and finding that perfect person that they think they need is very hard. After about a year, they offer the position to a newly ordained woman who's in her 30s, who had been an art major and has worked at a local bookstore while she was in seminary. So she arrives and begins weekly meetings with anybody interested who's in coming up with this new ministry to reach students. The parishioners have lots of ideas, largely based on their own past experience of college and how church helped them while they were in college, and how they imagined it must be for students today. Then, in their research, they find a program which is wildly successful out in Seattle in reaching college students. It's a Sunday evening compline service. And so this new priest works with the choir director, who advises her to go slow, because the choir can't make another weekly commitment. And so they decide they're going to keep their outreach to once a month on Sunday nights. The new priest works really hard, puts together a wonderful liturgy to do this compline service. And so 6 months after her arrival, they're almost ready to start. Meanwhile, in the church, the naysayers are still around, and they're impatient. And they remind the rector the budget concerns and tell him in no certain terms the plan better work, which he, not meaning to put pressure on her, but in subtle ways, passes on to this new chaplain. So they make up these really cool artistic flyers, and they go down and put them up in the student union. And they create a church Facebook page for their Sunday night compline event. And the first time they have it, 2 kids from the university show up. The next month, November, 1 comes. And then it's Christmas, so they feel like they have to take a month off. In January, they talk again, and they redo the Facebook page, and they add other kinds of social media outlets like Instagram. They figure this will be great for advertising, and it really doesn't cost us anything. The new priest goes and attends a basketball game and is overwhelmed of actually how many students are there on the weekends, and yet she can't attract more than a couple of kids. They keep pushing and pushing, and every night, every time they do, eventually they see these 2 girls, these 2 very shy girls who really become attached in relationship to the new chaplain. And the church is really pleased at this pastoral connection, and they're 2 girls who they feel like they adopt. But the following December, the vestry agrees with the treasurer. They can't afford her position, and so they drop the program altogether. And thus ends the chapter of this way of doing ministry. Right now, we're going to pause the video to ask a couple of questions for you to discuss at your table. Often churches have the right idea, but they rely on the wrong approach. What were the strengths of this program? There are always strengths. What were the strengths of the program that they did? So talk about the strengths of their program and go ahead and write this down, as well as your comments on what happened. Now, as we continue, here's what Blackaby points out from Scripture, just the basis of this work. God is always at work around you. It is God's will to offer people the hope and power of the relationship that comes through this good news of Jesus. And importantly, that God works in very distinctive ways that you can see visibly. And here's some examples of only that God could be doing. And I challenge you to tell me which scriptures are these from. Ready? Here's the first one. God draws people to himself. God causes people to seek after him. God reveals spiritual truth. God convicts the world regarding sin and righteousness. And God convicts the world and people of judgment. These are things that only God does. And so when you see this at work in people, you can see that God is at work. When God is showing you where he is working, he is inviting you to join him. So here's a comparison story, which I took from his chapter 6, similar kind of ministry. A group of people in the church where he was a pastor began feeling that God might be calling them to a ministry among college students at the college in their own town. So they began to pray, asking God to guide them with this question: is he calling them to begin this kind of ministry? So Blackaby, as the pastor, gathered some students who attended the church and has them pray in this way. And at the end of praying, he says, go back to school this week and pay attention to see if God is showing you that he's already at work. He tells them to talk with people, but to ask deeper questions than regular everyday conversations, without being aggressive, not trying to be Bible thumpers, but just to ask them questions. And that if they see signs of God being at work, he says, stop what you're doing and stay with that person and really listen to what they have to say. On the third day after this meeting, one of the students was approached by another student she had seen in some of her classes. This other student asks her if she was a Christian, because she says, I have a lot of questions about the Bible. So the church girl skips class and keeps the conversation going. And as they walk and talk, the student tells her, actually, there's a group, 11 other students, who have all been talking about a Bible study, but they don't know where to begin. Following that conversation, the church felt like God is at work right here among students already. And so they began 3 Bible studies on the campus. So let's pause again. Again, I'm going to turn off the video with this question. What do you see that is different about this approach to mission? What do you see that's different about this approach from the first one? And can you imagine what it felt like to be the person who had prayed on that Sunday and then went to campus on Monday knowing I'm looking to see if God's at work? What would that be like? And then to have a student come up by Wednesday, ask her that question, and to think of all that happened simply because they prayed, they went and investigated and saw God at work and began a ministry. Blackaby's way of this portion of a call to mission is very much like reconnaissance, where the data you're getting from the satellite isn't enough. That you connect with God, and then you connect with people looking for signs of God at work. So here's, in a way, his how he begins this process. You start by praying. Only the Father knows what he has purposed for the people in your missionary. And only the Father knows the best way to accomplish his will there. He knows the people more than you do. He knows the situation more than you do. He knows the before and after. So only God knows the big picture. So you have to begin by asking God, is this what we're supposed to be doing? After you pray, you have to watch to see what God does next. You have to take note, where do you see signs of God at work? Where do you see those signs of things that only God can do? So you have to get down and make that connection and looking for what happens. Then you got to make the connection, number 3, between what you prayed about and then what you're seeing and hearing. Perhaps you see a conversation and someone is saying, I'm struggling to explain to my grandchild what happens at time of death. Or somebody comes and as you're talking to say, why do these things happen in life? Or maybe they describe some kind of a need. Make the connection between what you prayed and that God is showing you something, because now you know that God is at work right here around you. If you don't pay attention to what follows your prayer, you may miss God's answer. In these conversations, ask probing questions. I don't mean, terrible questions or Bible questions, but just don't chat about trivial matters and sports and things like that when you meet up with people. Ask questions like this. So what's been happening in your life lately? Or how about, what's the greatest challenge you're having to deal with right now? Maybe you might ask something like, what's the most significant thing happening in your family? Perhaps you could ask, wow, it seems like you got a lot of stuff going on in your family. Is there any way I can help? Or even this one, how can I pray for you? The 4th step is this, to listen attentively. Answer those questions where you think God is at work in this person's life. Begin to give your answer to some of those questions. Reveal perhaps the way that God is inviting you. These questions will reveal the way God is inviting you to join him. So be prepared to respond. If someone confides a personal need, pray for that person and ask God how you might minister, practically speaking, in response. Be ready to share how Christ's presence in your life has made a difference and how Christ is ready to enter their life and helping them to change and grow. I hope you can see the difference between the classic Episcopal approach to local mission and the shoes on the ground approach, where you're actually looking for, where is God already at work? Now, I have some more questions for you. What do you find exciting about this approach? What do you find hard to believe or accept? And this one, would you like to try? If this sounds scary, you need to go back to read the earlier pages, where he explains the difference between a self-focused life, not that you're a bad person, but if you're only looking to yourself and your church as having enough resources for what you do, you will always fear failure. But when you look to God and you have a God-focused view, you know that you're looking not at your resources, but at God, who's the one who supplies every need, even the conversation, even the prayers. Because it's God who loves people more than us. And it's God who only asks us to be faithful. So compare these two approaches. And then, time remains, I have another question.